We as a mining industry have never been looking for special treatment or government adoption or anything like that. What we've always been looking for is really just a fair playing field.
I could imagine 20 years from now, why would I not be mining Bitcoin if I'm going to heat my home anyway? It seems to me like the delta there is a fundamental understanding of Bitcoin that I think over 20 years will be resolved.
The entire industry learned the lesson of 2017, which is that miners don't decide what happens in Bitcoin. We're ultimately fork followers, not fork creators.
Whether I like it or not, the market is going to seek profit maximization. And if they can accumulate more Bitcoin, they're going to do it. It is truly inevitable.
This idea of like what software has the most nodes equals the most votes equals the development signal, like that doesn't really honor the role that the node plays within the economy of Bitcoin.
Hey everyone, Michael here with the Bitcoin Way podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Today on the show, I have Harry Sudock. He is the Chief Business Officer at CleanSpark. He's an awesome guy. One of the earlier Bitcoiners I remember hearing on podcasts, and just interesting perspectives all around. We talked a lot about the Trump administration, what that has meant for the mining industry, the future of mining, governments and utility companies adopting Bitcoin mining companies as a load balancing act, and much, much more. Very fascinating conversation. Really hope you enjoy this one. Hey, everyone. Like I said in the intro, I've got Harry with me. Harry, welcome to the Bitcoin Way podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. I think you're one of the earlier people I started listening to back in probably 22 or 23. So I'm excited we finally get to talk. And I told you offline, I candidly don't have a whole lot of folks from the mining space on the podcast, and it's one of the areas I would say is a weaker point for me in terms of depth of knowledge. So I think this will be fun. Where I want to begin, though, is I want to get your perspective as someone who is operating deep in the mining space on just sort of some current events. So first and foremost, many Bitcoiners were cheering on the Trump presidency. And I think many have been disillusioned with, the strategic reserve and that. But I'm curious because it seems like when you have a shift of administration, and certainly on something like energy, it seems like there's a fundamentally different approach. What's changed in the last, 8 months, call it? And if anything, what are you seeing? And are you optimistic for the direction we're headed as it relates to what you're working on?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the Cliff Note version is that extremely optimistic, but maybe not for the reason that so much of the Bitcoin community got excited, now, I guess, 12 or 14 months ago. Basically, we as a mining industry have never been looking for special treatment or government adoption or anything like that. What we've always been looking for is really just a fair playing field by which we can make our businesses exist and thrive. We don't need a handout or a subsidy or anything like that for the Bitcoin mining industry to do its job, which is to secure the network as well as balance the energy systems all across our country. And so just being on even footing, whether that's with the EIA and some of the data requests that came out late in the Biden term, or the SEC and the the public company rules and regs and reporting that was asked of us as a sector, just taking the chilling effect off of those regulatory bodies and being able to compete on the merits of our business models. That was really the goal in the change in administration. Are there great things that have happened, as well, whether it's the release of Ross or the Genius Act or other state level strategic reserves? Like, that's all great. And I think Ross in particular was a signal around what this administration was going to stand for. But at the end of the day, we're a market participant. We're a market participant in how we procure energy. We're a market participant in how we interact with the Bitcoin that we're able to deliver the proof of work to earn. And as long as those market forces are allowed to grow, thrive, and compete, we feel that we're in a supportive economic environment. It was really the chilling effect and the unfair treatment under a previous administration that frustrated us and motivated us as a cohort to be very supportive of one side over the other. And I think we've received that. I think that, the difference was night and day. And it continues to be a great place to do business and to scale the mining sector here in the US.
So what could you give me some specifics on what has changed, like, in terms of like the mechanics of your business, how you would describe it as a more free and open market, in
Mhm.
what how maybe what Trump is either allowing or at least allowing you to perceive to be some latitude you have to operate versus like the previous administration?
Yeah, I'll point to a couple of concrete examples. The first is the rollback of SAB 121, which allows for a banking institution to interact with a customer deposit in the form of Bitcoin. So if you were to rewind the clock to the previous administration and you wanted to have, you know, we're talking about the mortgage collateral and Bitcoin being a qualified asset. So if I wanted to put, 1 Bitcoin worth of Bitcoin into a bank and then have that deposit count as collateral when I go to have my home mortgage issued, the bank would not only have to hold that deposit amount of Bitcoin for me. Now, self custody is the preferred method of holding Bitcoin, but let's say I needed to get a mortgage, I wanted to post more collateral. The bank would then have to hold 1 Bitcoin's worth of cash, of their own cash, in order to just have a deposit from a customer. And so that type of collateral requirement makes it financially unviable for the bank to ever touch this asset or interact with this industry. That's not a law. That's not a regulation. That's guidance from regulators as to how they would look favorably upon the bank behaving. It's these soft power type of dynamics between regulators and institutions where there's no law that goes through Congress that says that, but there's a group of unelected bureaucrats who make their opinion known, and that opinion then has a huge amount of influence over the behavior of a market participant in the form of the bank. That's one example. Um, Another example is really just the SEC review process. So, before my time at CleanSpark, I had a company called Grid Infrastructure. We took that company public via SPAC, and so we signed the merger agreement with our SPAC partner Thanksgiving of 2021. We didn't get listed on the public market until New Year's Eve 2023.
Oh,
So it took
wow.
us 25 months of review of not material financial or accounting items that we ended up being correct on how we were treating them. But the comments that we would receive were things like the Securities and Exchange Commission reserves the right to comment further. And so that's a way of saying you're fine, but you can't go out yet. And so that put undue burden and pressure on our shareholders. It robbed the market of the opportunity to have interaction with another public company aiming to just build their business, and creates the chilling effect that we've seen today. Now, if you were to try to go through that process, you do everything right, you pay the attorneys, you pay the accountants, what they need in order to shape your reporting and disclosures into the form that the public markets expect and deserve, you're able to accomplish that process in well under half the time. You've seen it through some of these reverse mergers that have happened. You've seen it through some of the SPACs that have happened, and as well as the IPO market that's been unblocked as well. And so you're seeing just the deal timelines massively compress, which is great for the shareholders in the company. It's great for public company investors. And the whole market is much more vibrant when you have more options to choose between. So, what the previous administration did was create a chilling effect where less companies were able to get public. We had two dirty words in our deal, which one of them was SPAC and the other one was Bitcoin. Neither of those were acceptable structures under that form, and we suffered from that. So, in short, the regulatory environment is far more inclusive of pro-business opportunities, and we think that ultimately best serves shareholders, operators, and the public market investors as a whole, because they're able to make choices and vote with their investments, the way they deserve to.
That's fantastic. No, I'm glad to hear that, and I can imagine 25 months you were just banging your head against the wall, wondering why. I'm curious though. So not to rain on your parade, because that's good to hear. Do you have concerns that? Well, let me sort of give you my thesis. Is that if Trump, who I voted for and supported, but have many private disagreements with what's happened since he took office. If he can continue, though, to be a net benefit to the mining industry, my thesis is that it might be enough, like lift off for Bitcoin over the next 3.5 years, that even if we get an unfavorable administration to much of this stuff, it's simply too late for them to really impede the progress that we've made. Do you agree with that, or do you have concerns about? Because like I don't know what he's done with mining and energy in particular, but a lot of executive order stuff that can get quickly unwound. Do you have any concerns that an administration here 3.5 years down the road could undo much of the forward progress that you feel like you're making?
I think there's always a risk there. Um, but I also think that, you know, Bitcoin has no political party, but we do have an enormous number of constituents as an industry. That goes for mining, it goes for energy abundance, it goes for general data centers, it goes, for just the holders of sats who want to have a savings technology available to them on a self-custodial basis. So I think that, what's our best defense against potential administrative pushback in a future world is just to get more Bitcoiners educated and holding their Bitcoin and having them represent their viewpoint at the ballot box and more generally. And I think that, there's like a toothpaste has left the tube effect with where we stand right now. Part of that is that the current treatment guidance, et cetera, is getting integrated into the financial system broadly. Whether that's ETF approval, no matter how you kind of feel about that product, it's out there. It's in a lot of people's hands, and people don't want to see that get impeded. Or that's just the existing cohort of regulation has been digested pretty broadly by the marketplace, and so it's just hard to go back. It's easy, and we saw this in some ways with the Biden executive order around AI. The easiest way for government to intervene is to kill something in the cradle before it's had a chance to get out into the world, to grow up and become a teenager and become a young adult and become a titan of industry, as it grows up. The most fragile moments in any emerging technology are the earliest days. We saw this with Bitcoin on a technical level. We saw this with Bitcoin from a market structure perspective. And now I think that, we certainly have a teenager, if not a young adult, in Bitcoin and in the regulatory treatment that we see here in the US. So I think never stop being vigilant, never stop being critical and concerned with what could happen. But I think that our level of resilience as an open market for this new monetary primitive, I think we're in a pretty strong position to weather the pendulum as it swings politically.
Fantastic. I hope you're right. I would say I'm unconvinced that all of the toothpaste is out of the tube, but
Mhm.
hopefully sufficiently much that it's going to be very difficult to unwind from. And I think we could make a lot of progress here over the next few years, even if the Trump administration ends up not being as, pro Bitcoin as we might hope, just kind of leaving the industry to be, I think would be a massive win. So that's, I think what we can hope for. Okay, so I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up with you, just because it is like the topic of the day. But you heard people yelling at each other about knots versus core. I'm curious if and maybe you have like an individual perspective, and you have a miner's perspective, and you think about fees and what that looks like in the future. Could you just fill me in on how you approach this sort of philosophically, and if you land on a side and you're willing to share, great. Otherwise, just to what extent is the mining industry concerned about this?
Um, I it's a complicated and broad topic. The first is that I think that the role of nodes is not being particularly um, well discussed, and this idea that like a node equals a vote is sort of misspecified. At the end of the day, running a node is fundamentally a selfish behavior, and that's good. So if I run a node and I receive a UTXO and I validate it against the node that I ran from source, from zero, regardless of what software implementation that is, that's the mechanism by which a node exerts its power, is because there's a relationship to my economic behavior, which is the UTXO, and the node is performing an audit function against my economic power. This idea of like what software has the most nodes equals the most votes equals the development signal, like that doesn't really honor the role that the node plays within the economy of Bitcoin. And so that's just something that kind of rubs me, which I think we lost the plot a little bit in 2017, not to date myself. But the UASF movement around SegWit no 2x versus SegWit 2x, that node running an implementation, framework was incredibly powerful and was able to demonstrate the will of, the Bitcoin community. But it was equally important that when the hard fork happened, people sold their BCH for Bitcoin. And so I think that, there's a continuum of soft power that happens over the development cycle. And that soft power arc gets concluded with a hard power event, which is a fork. And when the fork happens, people exert hard economic power by selling one and buying the other, doing nothing, or the opposite, selling, two for one. So understanding the governance mechanics in Bitcoin at a more deep and fundamental level is important. And it feels like the discussion that we're having remains fairly surface level relative to sort of the depth of conflict and conflict resolution that the Bitcoin community has been through when there is truly non-consensus proposal litigation that happens across the community. So, I don't have a super strong grounded opinion in one or the other. I don't write code for a living, which is probably better for everybody. But I don't. But, I try to bring a deep and first principled view to what's happening around me to try to understand it. And, right now, the reason that I think this debate can kind of get to such a high temperature is because there's just a lack of skin in the game, right? Nobody's being told, like, nobody's put to the test of like sell fork 1, buy fork 2, and show
Right.
us what you really think. And so it's easy to have a really loud debate when there are ultimately relatively low stakes, because
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
you go to a,
100%.
you go to a sports game and you see everybody argue. You get onto a battlefield and the relationship's a little bit different. And that's kind of what this feels like where we are today. I think that the the concept that you're going to filter your way into Valhalla is somewhat unreasonable. And from a miner's perspective, we're in the business of working for users of Bitcoin, and we're profit-seeking entities where if there's a high fee to be paid for a transaction, we include it. We also participate in a large pool environment because we don't want to be in a non-private or in a private mempool environment. I think Merch on X did a good post about the risk of private mempool, like privatization of mempools, and the censorship resistant risk, and some of the obfuscation risk that can come from that. So I think that we as miners are some of the longest term thinkers in the space, because we'll buy an ASIC and we expect to run that ASIC for 3 to 5 years. And so we need Bitcoin to be an economic force for at least that period of time, because that's where we risked our capital. And that means that we're ultimately trying to maximize the area of value under the curve, not the high watermark of value at any point in time. And so we try to be very measured. the entire industry learned the lesson of 2017, which is that miners don't decide what happens in Bitcoin. We're ultimately fork followers, not fork creators. And because of that, I think that, the developers and the users of the Bitcoin economy need to kind of hash it out and then ask us to participate at the end. At which time we're highly motivated to kind of ride along because we made those multi-year investments in order to do that. So take it from someone who's been around long but shorter than many, that continuing to return to deep first principled thinking about what is the value of censorship resistant provable digital scarcity, and what is the, censorship resistance is important. It's not just a freedom of speech concept, it's also a freedom of association concept. And so the values around freedom of association means that if you're operating within compliance as the rule set of the network dictates, you should have maximal freedom to associate under that rule set. And I'm not putting JPEGs on the blockchain because I think that's not going to maximize my area under the curve. But I also think that picking winners and losers didn't work in a fiat environment, and it's likely to not win in a more open environment either. So ultimately, anything that can be solved with an economic force is best solved by an economic force.
Yeah, I think that's well said. So when you talk about the, forgive me for playing catch up on a lot of the, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, and as I mentioned, I'm relatively newer still. The privatization of mempools. Are you talking about like these private channels for getting your transaction confirmed in a block while bypassing the breadth of the network, like a slipstream, that sort of? And do you think that's a? And you think that's a? Do you have concerns that would be like a more mainstream means of prioritizing one's transaction in the future, depending on a direction that we go? Or do you think that's inevitably going to happen more? Or do you think that's just like a side concern that some people have?
I think it's a point in time right now. I think there's like an old joke about inflation, which is the cure to higher prices is higher prices. And so I view it kind of similarly, which is like right now, if you want to do some sort of non-standard something, or whatever the case may be, you would go to a private environment and bid it out of band, basically. So that'll drive up prices, but the cure to higher prices is just to get higher prices in the mempool when you're able to get that corpus of economic activity to be bid on in the auction format more aggressively. That's the way through. And so, I think we've seen a protracted low fee environment here, and that's a gift for, personal self-sovereign holders of Bitcoin, because you get to do some UTXO consolidation along the way. But ultimately, low fees aren't going to last forever if this economic experiment's going to work at scale. And so I think back to like, what's the fundamental trade that miners are all engaged in every minute of every day? And there's 4 legs to it. You're long Bitcoin, you're long transaction fees, you're short difficulty, and you're short energy prices. And the combination of those 4 legs together equals mining business. And I think that ultimately being long Bitcoin and being long transaction fees are like easy things to say and maybe understand like the first order of, but there's a second, third, and fourth order of what it means to engage in those pieces of the network that emerge when you start to say, okay, well, great. If we're long fees, how do we gain value from fees going up over time? Is it number of transactions? Is it fee per transaction? Is there a lightning read through to that? Is there a sidechain read through to that? What does all of that mean when you get into like a highly complex emergent economic environment, which Bitcoin ultimately fosters? And then, that's where I start to think about like, what are the universes of financial services that need to exist, whether on an open source software basis or a third party provisioned basis to make a Bitcoin based economy highly functional.
Okay. All righty. Last hot topic that I think everyone's thinking about these days in and out of Bitcoin is AI. And so I'm going to tell you some. I remember, Luke Groman, I assume, or
Mhm.
you've heard him before. I remember him talking about he. This was just an example he was providing, and it was that with the growth of electric vehicles, I think I'm probably going. I'm not. I have no background in electronics, the electrical grid, nothing. But there's a lot of copper required, right, for the generation of electricity, getting it to and from your home, and the way that a lot of the hardware has been built is obviously very copper dependent, and it's for I can't remember what the part is that he was talking about in our power lines, but he said it wasn't really made for electric vehicles. Like there was the concept is right, like these things burn hot all day long, and then when people go to bed, they cool off, and then they burn hot all day long. And with electric vehicles and similar technologies, we're really running these things hot in a way that they weren't designed to be run. And so he started talking about like the supply chain risks to the grid. And so China is buying up copper. The United States doesn't even realize, perhaps, at least not to the extent that China does, that copper is going to go up in price because the demand for it, with everything happening in the world, is it's going to get crazy, and AI is going to be one of the things that fuels that. I don't exactly know what question I'm asking you here. I'm more framing sort of this knowledge that I gained listening to Luke, and I'm trying to wrap my head around, do we have the infrastructure, the supply chain, the raw materials that we need to both support AI and for the Bitcoin mining space to continue to grow as it might naturally, if we did have, all the materials that we need to make it happen?
There's a tremendous amount in that question. Um, I want to attack it two ways, and coming from my clean spark perspective, we certainly have a point of view. The the Bitcoin mining business finds itself in somewhat of a superposition as it relates to the trends that you're talking about. And I'll explain. The first is that we've spent the last 5+ years as a sector gobbling up contracted power in a way that almost no other industry has. And somewhere at the end of 2023, ChatGPT got released, and everybody realized that there was going to be a I don't know, whatever the power plant equivalent of a bank run is on power contracts. And that's hard because, it's a physical contract. It's not a digital one. And so there's some, world of atoms dynamics, whereas the world of bits might be able to flex up and down more easily. But once you got to put a shovel in the ground, the dynamics change. And so, Bitcoin miners found themselves in a really interesting position because they got a lot of this stuff under contract really, early. The second is that as electricity demand, especially on a firm basis, goes up, the value of flexible consumption also goes up. And so that's how we run our business today, is that the vast majority of our deployed Bitcoin mining compute infrastructure is designed to be able to run on a flexible basis. And what's interesting is that utilities are kind of only in a tough spot maybe 200 hours a year, where the peak of their generation matches the peak of their usage on, the aggregate customer base. So think the hottest day of the summer, coldest day of the winter kind of dynamic. And so that's the structural dynamic as we see it today, is that contracting megawatts is hard. We've got a lot of them. Consuming electricity on a flexible basis is hard. We're really good at it. And so that's a really compelling position, certainly for CleanSpark, is the way we've thought about, our business. We've got over a gigawatt under contract, and we know how to consume it in a way that supports, the broader system, And we realize the economic value of that flexibility. So that's the good about our industry and where we are. The challenge is that we're not making enough energy, and we're going to need to make more. We're not just going to need to make more, we're going to have to transmit it, all over our country. And so when part of what Luke's talked about is some of the commodity and raw supply chain challenges, but there's like all the other challenges of great, we go build a new nuclear power plant somewhere. That's incredible. How do we hook that into the system? How do we move those electrons all over the wires to make sure they go where they're supposed to? Our energy grid is one of the crowning engineering achievements on the planet, because it's a patchwork, right? There's no, the grid is not one thing. There are three distinct zones, which are East, West, and Texas. And then within each of those zones, there's a huge amount of kind of quilt-like sections. Some of them overlap, some of them touch, some of them have agreements, some of them don't, all of that kind of granular complexity that emerges from it. So I think that, going back to being a first principled advocate, Bitcoin miners own a lot of the contracted availability of electrons, disproportionately to maybe you would expect a company of our size or our industry size. Number two is we at CleanSpark have a unique ability to consume it very flexibly. Number three is we need to produce a lot more, move a lot more around, and figure out how we're going to serve these changing demand functions for power at a very fundamental basis. The generation of electricity is going to be one of the great challenges of our time.
So you said that typically call it 200 hours that their peak output equates about to the amount that people are demanding at that time, which to me sounds like at the moment, most of the time we have a surplus being created, which is good. I mean, ultimately, in Bitcoin can help balance that load because, to your point, you can flip it off when you need to at those peak hours, and you can flip it back on pretty easily. Do you see us approaching a time in the near future that they are at capacity much more often? And if so, what would be driving that? Is it just, is it AI? Is it other usages that, maybe I'm not thinking of?
The short answer is I think that's pretty likely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, the gross demand for power is going up. It's going up because of AI. It's going up, think about like a silly example, right? You shut off 100,000 gas cars and you put on 100,000 electric cars. Same amount of energy, but one of them is putting stress on the network of fuel pumps across our country. The other is putting stress on the network of outlets. And so you're shifting the same energy from A to B, but B puts strain on our electric system. A doesn't have any relationship with our electric system. And so those are some of the complexities around there. And it's, why, we talk about power versus electricity. Car runs on power. It's just combustion engine power. And so thinking about where does that happen? How does that happen? Batteries are still kind of an open technology question, a material science question that's getting solved over time. Renewables remain kind of an opaque, subsidy obscured type of generation that may work great, but right now introduces some complexity and risk around the duck curve in each of these energy markets. And so when I talk about the concept of a complex adaptive emergent system, energy is a great example. There's no central planner. There's just a bunch of competing market forces that can't quite reconcile with each other because the future is different than the past. Mm-hmm. And so as you go through a technological shift, which AI certainly is, which the advent of electric vehicles certainly is, which is the changing dynamics around what it takes to build an interconnect generation, all of those are technology enabled, right? The SMR or the fourth generation SMR, small modular reactor nuclear plant, It didn't exist a while ago. Now it does. And so you're seeing a system that has a lot of market forces kind of baked into it try to react to changes in technology, and it's not going to do a perfect job. And anytime you have that type of dynamic, it means there's a huge opportunity for businesses to come in and solve problems. And that's really where we find ourselves. You know, we've been solving the problem historically with our Bitcoin mining business. We're looking and exploring what it'll take to solve some of these problems with a potential AI business. And so when you see an environment where the dynamics are changing, especially when they're changing because technology is evolving, it means that's where your biggest opportunities are going to be.
Yeah. Alrighty. So maybe a string of dumb questions here, but I'm curious. So is the way that you work through these contracts, is it directly with, first of all, is it directly with the utility companies in a particular jurisdiction? Is that how, like, is that who you're actually negotiating with?
The insufficient answer is it depends.
Okay.
In
What does it depend on?
So, you know, right now we operate in 4 states. We operate in Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wyoming, and they're all a little different. And so in Georgia, what's really interesting is that the municipality, in many cases, is the utility. So you're really contracting with the city for power. Whereas in Tennessee, you're working with TVA, who does the generation and distribution. And then they've got over 150 local power companies who you actually contract on a tri-party basis with. So you're contracting with the local utility and you're contracting with TVA. That's 2 layers of utilities that end up landing the power at your facility. And then Wyoming's different as well, where you just go straight direct to the utility.
Okay. S- Tennessee sounds like the most complicated. Would that be correct, or do they? Or it sounds like just more layers that you have to sift through.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I think that each of them has, well, and this is what's been so fascinating because I came into Bitcoin with no energy background whatsoever, and you know, like with anything, I had to read. Um, and each of the jurisdictions where we operate look a lot different in their form, but you land in the same place every time because the same kind of overarching dynamics govern you, which is that you want to get really low cost power in order to, you know, fund the biggest input cost for your mining business. And you need to give them back some flexibility in order to unlock that low cost power. And so
Mhm.
that 200-ish, you know, give or take hours a year rings true across all of the structures, even though the structures look kind of different.
Okay. So, okay, so you negotiate these contracts, and I assume you have to bring. Are there like guarantees that you have to bring to the table that you'll shut down within a certain amount of time if they reach peak and they need, you know, more bandwidth, or like what exactly are you? And I guess maybe sort of a secondary question to this: are you finding them to hear that a, you know, a Bitcoin mining operation wants to negotiate rates, and they're like, are they, what, you know, what the hell are these guys doing? They're mining this, you know, or are they very open to it? Are they beginning to understand like the grid, you know, like the load balancing implications? Like where are we at in this today?
Yeah. Um, the first is that it depends on the interruptible piece. You know, some there's a agreement to curtail because they need the power back.
Hmm.
In other places, we face off against a market price on a piece of our power. So when it gets too expensive, also happens to be the time they need the power back. And so we're
Okay.
naturally, based on a market signal, doing that same curtailment activity. Um, what I would say is that, you know, I signed our first power contract before CleanSpark at Grid in 2019, and the conversations look a lot different between then and now. Frankly,
In a good
they're
way?
oh yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah. One is that Bitcoin like was this super scary thing that was never going to work back then. Um, we'd already gone from, you know, 900 to 19,000 back to 3,000, and you know, nobody liked Bitcoin, or at least nobody was willing to bet a 5 or a 10 or longer year utility agreement on this crazy volatile asset. Um, so that was the first challenge then, was like, is your company going to exist or not? And that drove, you're right, some of the collateral requirements that they had around what does it take to enter into a contract, with a utility. And then they got comfortable with that. We were able to build the business. But I think the value of the flexible customer has been demonstrated a lot more over time, whether it was during the COVID era or, where you had the conflict in Eastern Europe and commodity prices went all over the place. And so you saw a price driven volatile energy market and the Bitcoin miners react during sort of 22. Then in 23, you saw huge winter storms throughout the winter, and Bitcoin, I think we gave back 30,000 households worth of power at grid during that time. And then more recently with the hurricanes in Eastern Tennessee and Georgia for us, we curtailed operations to give power back to hospitals and firehouses. And
Yeah.
so we got to see that in real time and shake people's hands and tell the story of, why do we do this business the way that we do it? It's because the world is an uncertain place and we all need a shock absorber, and an economically motivated shock absorber to be able to help when things go sideways. And a group of people who understand the value of community and the value of human life is going to supersede any moment in business, and be able to respond to that dynamic in real time and provide value and benefit, to those electric systems when that, God forbid, happens again. So the conversations with the utilities have gotten easier, and their understanding of the value proposition has only grown. And, I think that one of the big catalysts and changes in that discussion is, we used to be, pounding the phone, prospecting for where we were going to go next. And at some point it flipped and they call us.
Man, that's amazing. Are you doing any sort of like educational outreach? I imagine there are so many areas of the country who have been untouched by Bitcoin mining. And some of it is probably a cost of electricity thing. It's just not competitive.
For sure.
But I would imagine that there are many places where it's kind of a matter of time. Are you? I understand you're probably very myopically focused on Clean Spark, but to what extent is there like outreach to try engaging government utility companies to partner with Bitcoin mining companies more broadly than just your operations?
We do it all. We invest heavily in education in DC. We do it in all of our states. Um, and we try to attend and educate at as many of the utility conferences and we can get boots on the ground to. Because, I think ultimately, there's a version of the future where every substation has a Bitcoin mine attached to it. Every power plant has a Bitcoin mine attached to it. And Bitcoin just is the enabler for abundant electricity across our country and maybe across the world, but I can't really speak to that. So, I think that as you look to the future of the Bitcoin mining industry, deeper integration between utilities and miners is going to be an enormous tailwind. But it's just going to take time to kind of figure out all the hardware and the commercial and the electrical and engineering based pieces of those types of solutions. But I think that, at the end of the day, we need to generate more electricity. We want to have a more prosperous society. And Bitcoin mining is one of the tools that we have in our tool belt to get there. And that means I think that it'll continue to grow and infuse itself into all the places where it belongs.
So your vision of like every substation being attached to a mining rig, what's the biggest hurdle? Is it physically acquiring the miners? Is it the obvious education hurdle I imagine we have to cross? I could imagine it being a number of things. Is there something in particular that you view as like, if we could just solve for this, I think we would get to that future much more quickly?
I think the hardware and the supply chain is part of it.
Yeah.
I think that, what the proto guys at Block are working on is an interesting piece of that story as we look to reshore additional layers of manufacturing and the supply chain. Um, I also think that like contract, I view innovation across sort of three layers. The first layer is like the technology has to get upgraded, right? So we went from a world without Bitcoin to a world with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin brought proof of work into the world. On an economic basis, proof of work existed before, but it was never attached to an economic market like Bitcoin. The next layer of innovation is typically contractual innovation, and that's where I think we are right now, which is I don't think that the utilities know how to contract with a Bitcoin miner in a way that lets us deploy mining capabilities at every level of the electric system. They're great for being able to run our business. Those contracts are more than sufficient. But the next level of integration just requires the next level of contractual innovation. And then the third layer of innovation is regulatory and government. And that one
Okay.
takes the longest. And so the technology, the contracts, and the regulatory regime, that's sort of the progression of every advancement that we've ever seen. You saw the internet, right? You had like 5 nodes on the internet. Then you had the contractual ability for doing business with the internet. That was next. And then, most people don't know this, but you couldn't, the internet existed for like 20 years before you could swipe a credit card on a website. And
Yeah.
that was regulatory based, right? It was illegal to use a credit card on the internet until the early to mid 90s. And
Hmm.
so that was that third leg of the stool. And until that happened, you could never have an Amazon or a Shopify or a app store. Like none of that infrastructure could be developed because the regulations hadn't evolved to meet the technology and the contracts where they were. And so I think we're going to see the same type of roll forward where we're somewhere in between the technology innovation and the contractual innovation right now. And it'll take all three legs of that stool to be fully put in place in order for Bitcoin mining to really get integrated at every level of the electric system across the country.
So you think to some degree it's an extent of pounding and breaking down the right doors to like that handful of people who are willing to stick their neck out there, uh, create a contract like one that's never been created, give it a test run, and then once you've got that use like a case study that you can demonstrate, well now you can continue knocking on everyone else's doors and breaking those down, and this is kind of how I see these things playing out is it becomes this unstoppable force. And then that next level up, they have to start paying attention. It exists in the world, sort of the way Bitcoin is no longer an infant.
Exactly.
Uh,
But like
okay.
the internet's our big brother, right? Like Bitcoin's little bro, internet's big bro in this model. And AI is like the littlest bro
Mm,
in our little family that we've created. And so I think that it's important, people forget just how quickly this stuff moves. But just in my lifetime, we went from having like one family computer that kind of had the internet. It made the like noise.
yep.
Um, and you couldn't use your phone if you were also using the computer. Um, to having 5 computers on your person every single day, all the time, right? So that happened in a couple of decades. And so
Yeah.
the ability for a technology to one go from invention to maturity and maturity to mass distribution, those network effects are very, very fast. And when they're built in a stackable way, like Bitcoin's built on the internet, Bitcoin's built on mobile. Those are both distribution mechanisms that the internet didn't have. The internet had to bootstrap distribution from zero, right? It kind of bootstrapped on phone lines, and then everybody kind of agreed that phone lines were not the greatest way to deliver internet. And so AI is going to be the same way. AI gets delivered to your laptop, it gets delivered to your phone, it gets delivered to your Vision Pro if you have one, or your smartwatch if you have one. So there's like all of these well-established distribution mechanisms that make future network effects run a lot faster. And
Mm.
so this is like the idea that the accelerationists will inherit the earth, because the internet walked so that Bitcoin could run and AI could fly.
I love that. Okay. Interesting. So I'm wondering, as someone who, again, operates very deeply in the mining space, there's sort of this little mini revolution going on of solo mining.
Mhm.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I'll tell you. So the Bitcoin way, one of the things we'll help people do is spin up and configure their BitAx or whatever their open source miner is. And so it's something we get excited about and kind of geek out about. I think it's a really cool way for people to engage in something that maybe doesn't require the upfront capital of like a hosted mining solution. Learn a bit about how it works and apply a terahash to the network or whatever. I'm curious if you have thoughts on solo mining and if you see any potential for scale that might either compete with sort of the traditional mining business model or at least augment the network in some meaningful way.
I think of solo mining basically as virtuous lotteries,
Mhm.
right? So like you buy a lottery ticket, it's gambling. You do a solo home mine, it's virtuous, right? There's positive good that gets contributed to the world because you're doing it. It's not an economically rational behavior,
Yeah.
and that's okay. I do lots of non-rational economic behavior in my personal life, um, and I think that it's a movement where if enough people want to participate in it, it can really make a meaningful impact. I think that there's, a few interesting things that are happening. One is that it's a bootstrapping mechanism for open source development, which is super exciting. I know Scott well, the, as he would say, lead instigator of the BitAx project. He's become a friend, over the last couple of years. I think what the 256 Foundation and Bitcoin Park are doing is really exciting. And so I think it's awesome. And I think like every big thing in its earliest days, I forget which VC said this, but it was a good quote, is that every big movement or company starts out looking like a toy. And so to me, this is an example of that. And maybe one hypothetical future state is like process heat is one of the most underutilized things we as modern humans do and use that we basically just have no idea what to do with efficiently. And so the Heatbit project that's happening is interesting out of some of the folks, from Denver and Colorado. So, the the bootstrapping mechanism for open source mining hardware and software, huge positive. The bootstrapping mechanism for innovation around process heat and alternative economic models for producing proof of work, super interesting. Do I think that the BitAx project, in the way that it stands today, is going to revolutionize proof of work for Bitcoin? Probably not. But I think that some of the emergent effects that it's instigating could be huge and really interesting. And I think that anything that moves our network towards a state of decentralization and towards economic decentralization is a great thing for Bitcoin.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I think that's well said. So, do you envision a future where everyone's heating their homes on using hash rate, or do you think that is part of this? It's interesting kind of thing. Like, because I could imagine 20 years from now, why would I not be mining Bitcoin if I'm going to heat my home anyway? Seems to me like the delta there is a fundamental understanding of Bitcoin that I think over 20 years will be resolved. I have no idea what's going to happen to the supply chain considerations. Like, can you get your hands on ASICs to even do that? But then we've been driving people out of the trades for the last 50 years, and finding people who can service that equipment is a whole other. That's, I mean, for me, that's one of the big stuff. If I have a miner heating my home and it breaks down, I'm not. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to source parts, and I certainly don't know who to call here in my hometown. But do you think over time that might be those issues could be resolved to the point where at scale that could be how we warm ourselves in the winter?
I don't know. We got a supercomputer in our pocket.
Don't
I'm not.
underestimate
I'm not betting
technology.
against anything. This is like my biggest lesson over the last 10 or 15 years is like pessimism doesn't pay. And I think
Yeah.
that we as a Bitcoin ecosystem serve ourselves well when we view the future possibility space through the more optimistic lens. And like, you know, I'm I forget when I was having this conversation, but it was a really good one. And somebody asked me, what if it doesn't work? The best answer is, what if it does?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that's my view. Is like, do I think it's likely? I don't know, but I'm not in the betting against stuff business. I'm in the betting for stuff business and trying to shape it to the best version I possibly can.
Okay. Alrighty, so that's probably an opinion that will resonate with many. Optimism first. So I've got to ask you. I'll ask you our final question here, and see if you came up with anything while we were talking. What is an unpopular opinion that you have? You get bonus points if you offend some Bitcoiners with it.
Um, my unpopular opinion is that financialization of Bitcoin is inevitable and good. And I view it really through the same lens when we talked about some of the software uh, uh, divergence of opinions, is that when you hand a market a new tool, the market is going to be price maximizing and profit seeking to the nth degree. To whatever
Hmm.
degree is possible, it will seek that equilibrium state of profit maximization. And so I think ETFs are great. I think Bitcoin treasury companies are great. I think that there are going to be winners and losers. I think that there's going to be catastrophic blowups. And I think that's all great because at the end of the day, Bitcoin needs to be resilient enough to thrive across all of those events if it's going to replace the dollar as a global settlement currency over any period of time, or at least be a credible off ramp for it. And so, I think the dollars are going to do great for a long time. I think the Bitcoin's going to do great for a long time. But the ability to experiment and drive the edge of innovation forward in financial markets, as well as hardware markets, as well as our energy markets, all of that seeking of the frontier is ultimately a positive activity because it's going to bring the best options to the table. It's going to reward the winners. It's going to punish the losers. And the market's going to do what it does best and arrive at a more positive sum state than it started.
Okay. So I'll just say for me personally, like I have a lot of issues, and a lot of it ultimately, I think a free market, do what you want. It comes down to a lot of the marketing, and I think um, the enthusiasm of people who are not professional investors who are getting riled up about like treasury companies, for example. They don't understand all of the risks. Yeah, I had Mark Moss on the podcast a few months ago. Like that guy's a professional investor. He understands all the counterparty risk, the operational, managerial, regulatory, confiscation. He understands all of that in a way that your average pleb on Twitter probably doesn't. Right? Or like, I'm not a professional investor, right? And so I have my concerns with what that will mean for people who get in over their heads on something that they just have no business being in, which I think is a fair concern. They have every right to operate that business. Do you think, though, regardless of how anyone feels about it today, I would envision a future where the type of financialization that we see now is very different because I think an economy based on a scarce decentralized money will drive, obviously, I think we would both agree, very different incentives than a fiat based economy that's trying to figure out what to do with Bitcoin. Like just even things like, more equity based investments into businesses versus debt, for example.
Um, there's so much in there. This is like a whole other episode. Um, I think that I one is I think I hear your concern loud and clear. I think that we as Bitcoiners need to fight against our instincts to create a sense of paternalization. If if you don't own Bitcoin on a self custody, independent, sovereign basis, and you're YOLOing into some Bitcoin treasury company, like you're doing it wrong. It's
Yeah.
bad. It's just a bad financial decision, most likely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the but but I have an appreciation for the inevitability of markets to seek the edge. So if I woke up one morning and had a $100 million zombie company that was in, software sales and didn't really know what it was doing with the future, but maybe had a bunch of cash on the balance sheet, I'd put all of that into Bitcoin as a totally rational decision. That's what Michael Saylor did.
Right. Right.
That
Yeah.
was 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Because while, like, and some of this comes back to like like a more of a philosophical desire. Like for me, converting existing treasuries into Bitcoin, accepting Bitcoin as payment, converting positive cash flow into Bitcoin, like those to me feel like the most honest, prudent means of accumulating Bitcoin and maintaining a Bitcoin treasury. But I understand, like you are correct that whether I like it or not, the market is going to seek profit maximization, and if they can accumulate more Bitcoin and be able to ride that wave by other instruments, they're going to do it. It is truly inevitable. So, yeah, I agree with you. Though I guess my warning to people is like take care of your own treasury first,
A
self
hundred
custody,
percent.
and then if you want to dabble in the investing and speculative space, like have at it. Just make sure you understand what it is you're getting into. Is
1000%. Rule number one is own more Bitcoin on a self-sovereign, self-custody basis at the end of every week that you're able to. If you just do that, you'll be fine.
Harry, I think that's well said and a good place to wrap. Thank you so much for your time, man. Why don't you give people a handoff? Tell them where to find you, where to learn about CleanSpark. Anything else you
Yeah.
want to share?
Yeah. I appreciate you having me on and getting the opportunity to spend this time together. You can find out more about CleanSpark at cleanspark.com. You can DM me on Twitter at Harry_Sudock with 1D. Otherwise, I'll see you on the internet.
Perfect. Harry, thank you so much for the time, man.
Awesome, Michael. Thank you, sir.
Cheers. And that's a wrap again. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Harry. Do me a huge favor. Go follow Harry on X. Check out CleanSpark. He's an awesome guy. Puts out some really good content related to the energy grid, to Bitcoin mining, AI, and more. And do me a huge favor. If you are enjoying the show, give us a like, subscribe, comment, share this with someone who you think might be interested. Anything to feed the algorithm and get the word of self-sovereignty out to everyone. We would really appreciate that. If you need help taking your Bitcoin into proper 100% self-custody, go to thebitcoinway.com/podcast. You can schedule a free 30-minute consult with a member of our team. We'd love to walk you through how we can help. We also help with online privacy, setting up privacy phones. As I said in the interview, we can help you set up your BitAxe or your solo miner. We've got a Plan B residency option for people who are trying to escape government tyranny all over the world. In beautiful tropical Panama. Again, it's thebitcoinway.com/podcast. Until next time, stay safe, stay sovereign, and remember the yield on Bitcoin is freedom.